youth is engaged with foreign policy issues. They have views on foreign policy issues. They very clearly specify, for example, what kind of partnerships they want India to have, or what kind of neighborhood policy they want India to have. I think the government perhaps is more in sync with the sensibilities, sensitivities, aspirations of the youth on the foreign policy front. An understanding of global politics is perhaps a required element in how you think about even issues like branding, or corporate strategizing. All the India programs, for example, that you have in foreign universities on India, they of course look at India through a lens which is pretty outdated. That is also a problem. Yes. So now you need the community, you need the Indian students, you need people who are going from India also, as you rightly say, as having a perspective on what India is doing and why it is doing.
Namaste, Professor Pant. Thank you for visiting Rishihut after a long time of our conversation. It is good to have you here. And I heard that the session at the Policy Bootcamp went really well. Particularly this time we have an increased focus on foreign policy, international relations, because just the last 10 years and more recently the G20 has tremendously increased the interest of youth in foreign affairs. And that has also become a political narrative as well, like as we had seen in the recent elections. So what are your understanding of how are youth looking at foreign policy? And I know that a recent survey where you authored about youth interest in foreign policy also came out. So where do you see the trends of young people and their interest in foreign policy? How has it been changing in more recent times?
Thank you, Shobit, for having me. And it's all, we have been talking about my coming here, and it's always wonderful to talk to a young audience, but I think on foreign policy, the conversations around the country, they have dramatically changed compared to even when we were young, or we were trying to think of foreign. I mean, it took us a long time to come to this idea that foreign or international affairs can be a mainstream subject of conversation. Today, it has become. I think youngsters are very, very actively engaged with what is happening around the world. Of course, technology and the availability of technology is one part of the equation. But also India is rising, and India's proactive diplomacy has played a role in generating this idea that the binary between domestic and foreign no longer exists as sharply as perhaps it did in the past. Today, every single policy issue that you think about today in this country has a global dimension. So I think it's very natural that many of them, many of the youth in particular, who are looking at the world today, will look at it through a different lens, engage with it much more proactively than perhaps we did in our times. And that is reflected in the survey that you talked about. We do an annual survey at ORF on foreign policy and youth. And we have seen, for example, how consistently youth is engaged with foreign policy issues. They have views on foreign policy issues. They very clearly specify, for example, what kind of partnerships they want India to have, or what kind of neighborhood policy they want India to have. And I think by and large what we have seen is that India's youth has been satisfied with the pace of foreign policy over the last decade. So there is certainly an element where I think the government perhaps is more in sync with the sensibilities, sensitivities, aspirations of the youth on the foreign policy front, as is reflected in our surveys. And I do think that is a reflection both of their own interest, but also India's growing voice on the global stage.
Good to know this, right? Because till some time back, at least on the educational front, foreign policy was seen as a specialization. But what we are seeing as a change is, as you are saying, as the world is getting interconnected, our awareness is increasing through social media, other domains. So we would always want to bring this into the curriculum for all disciplines, right? Because you cannot ignore it anymore. So at Rishihut, we, in the undergraduate program, right in the first semester, we have a course called Global Grand Challenges. So you need to understand what's globally happening, what is the world leaders dealing with as challenges, because it gives you a purpose to your education as well, right? And whatever I'm studying as a discipline, if I understand what are the global challenges, I will use that education to solve problems related to what's, like, for example, climate change, inequality, terrorism, whatever those are big challenges, and it has come out in your survey as well, that what challenges they see. So we are trying to bring in foreign policy as a mandatory kind of a course, even with the undergrad education. So do you see education changing in some way where foreign policy becomes like a core, not a elective anymore?
I think I have been also lecturing, for example, now in different institutions, including IITs and IIMs, where an understanding of global politics is perhaps a required element in how you think about even issues like branding, or corporate strategizing. I don't think you can have those conversations, even these conversations that perhaps are very niche, without looking at how the world is changing around you. And I think it's great that you are bringing this at a very undergrad level, because I do think that undergrads themselves have a stake in how these conversations evolve. Climate change or terrorism, I mean, these are issues. If they are not involved in the process, then our policy responses can also be disconnected from them. So I do think that that is very important, and I hope that it happens more often. Perhaps in our mainstream curricula also, we need to push that academically. If we are refining our the new education policy, for example, should bring to bear some of these conversations directly, because you can see that there is a lot of interest. So a lot of the youngsters who will be doing disciplines as diverse as IITs or education, sociology, anthropology, they are also interested in world affairs, in international relations, and what is India saying about the big challenges as you put it of the day. So I think there is a need to make it more mainstream, and my own sense is that if we don't do it, then it will also happen automatically, because the push from the people is going to be very strong, from the students is going to be very strong, because as you can see now they are reaching out to different sources, and they can easily go to online courses. They are doing these online courses, and of course if you go to places like YouTube, there are so many now places that you can do. Of course, the reliability of some of those sources can be questionable, but I think it just shows you the interest in foreign policy, national security, international affairs that cuts across, I think, disciplines, and that should become part of the mainstream discussions in our curricula.
It's good to know. I mean, because you have a global understanding, you have taught globally, so getting that endorsement from you means a lot to us that we are doing the right thing. Another reason that we do it for is because naturally many of these students will go abroad to study, and about 1 million students are going abroad a year to study nowadays. And even if they take up a job, their boardroom is global, right? And they are interfacing. The world doesn't have a very good understanding of India, right? Because in many ways, they are citizen ambassadors, right? When they go abroad, people will ask them questions. Campuses have become very political, as you can see globally now. So they'll understand what is India's stand on this war, right? They may not have a perspective if they don't know these things. So we are also preparing them to be our citizen ambassadors globally, because they are representing India at a global platform, and it's happening more and more every year. That's also a reason that we do this. So from your understanding of campuses globally, where a lot of multicultural students come in, do you find this a challenge that Indian students are unable to articulate India's stand for a global issue, as well as what the world thinks about India? They have a particular perspective about India, and we are unable to possibly explain our positions, our country's heritage in the right way. Do you see this challenge when you go abroad?
Yes, I do think that there is a particular problem, because you do have a certain kind of a narrative about India that is projected in the classical sense in which India is taught and India is studied, and so you have them in isolation from the larger, the mainstream of India that goes and studies abroad. And mostly these students from India who are going abroad to study, they go in technical issues, right? They study technical issues, and that means that their engagement with some of these sort of quote-unquote political questions is relatively limited. So their ability to also counter the narrative that is being projected from the other side, it becomes very limited. And often, you would not see that articulation being done in a manner that perhaps allows for that space to be created and to be nurtured. So certainly all the all the India programs, for example, that you have in foreign universities on India, they of course look at India through a lens which is pretty outdated. That is also a problem. So now you need the community, you need the Indian students, you need people who are going from India also, as you rightly say, as having a perspective on what India is doing and why it is doing, and conveying it also in a manner that perhaps allows a better understanding of India's position, which unfortunately is not there. We know that there is one narrative about India that continues to dominate, and that narrative perhaps is the dominant narrative at the moment. Universities, in media, in academia, and I think that can only change if you have more students aware and more students engage with this policy. Because in the past it used to be it's not needed. Today it is both needed and perhaps also a requirement of our times, that if you don't do it, then not only you are losing this this very important time that that is described as India's moment. But also, I think, positioning that narrative as a counter to the dominant narrative, which again continues to frame the way India is perceived by a lot of other stakeholders.
Interesting. So as Rishihood University, we are playing our role in, as I said, educating them about India, about the global challenges, our perspectives on them. But how have other countries possibly done this? For example, China, right? Even a lot of students from there go abroad. They may go in technical disciplines. Do you find a comparison? Do you see is a Chinese student able to explain their positions, their country better, or how do they deal with this so that we can learn something from them?
No, I don't think that China is a slightly different case, because there is a sense that it's a very regimented kind of approach to a number of these questions, and as a democracy we really can't replicate that model. But I don't think China and Chinese students also are particularly good at articulating their responses, and they have another problem that a lot of the students perhaps are not as good in English as perhaps many Indians are, or in as they go in these global universities and they articulate their positions. But I do think that giving this space to youngsters, whereby they may not have the full picture, but at least if they understand the basic ideas as to why India is doing certain things and why India is at the forefront of some of these conversations, and what is, as you put it, what is India's position on certain key global challenges or critical issues to India. I think that in and of itself becomes a means through which India also communicates with the world. Now, I think in the case of some of the other countries that we have seen, often there is a concerted attempt. For example, although China, as I said, is more of a regimented model, but then the state capacity is behind China. They do make an effort in that sense. Whereas in India, because of our democracy and because of the way you have the state versus the individuals, you do not get that kind of a support, and I don't think we should expect also, given the scale of movement and given the limitations of state capacity. So I do think that initiatives like yours, or if other institutions take it up, that might just elevate some of these challenges and allow for India to project perhaps a better argument or a better frame of reference for others to consider. I think China's approach has been very statist, whereas the European approach often is very individual centric. And I think India will have to find some balance between the two.
Right. So thank you for sharing that, because yes, we cannot expect the state to be grooming this million students or going abroad. Institutions like Rishihood will definitely play a role, but I also believe between institutions like Rishihood and ORF that you also represent, there can be possibilities of creating such type of handbooks, such type of sessions, so at least the basic general knowledge of how to articulate our positions, understanding the issues. Because they will be in a setup like when I went to the US, right? My colleagues have come from different parts of the world. They asked me very, very interesting questions, and all of them have a perspective. For example, a war is happening in Ukraine. A Russian student would have a very different take on it. I would have a different take on it. And many a times we walk away from these debates because we don't know how to position ourselves in the light of other issues, right? So we can possibly collaborate as institutions and create such type of content, right? And you talked about social media content, put up online so that anybody who goes abroad does a 101 on this and picks up that knowledge and goes abroad. Right?
Yeah, I agree. I think content creation is important, and content dissemination is important. And I think as a university, your ability to both create and disseminate is, can be much more efficient. I think what we are also witnessing now, for example, is that a lot of for example, we at ORF, we offer internships.
Yeah.
Now, a lot of the youngsters, for undergrads who are, they may be from different disciplines, completely unrelated to IR, but they often apply for these internships because they are interested. That's the sense you take. So we are interested in geopolitics and international affairs, and I think so. We are now, initially. Our internship approach to internships was restricted in the sense that we would only give internships to people who have some background.
Yeah.
But today, this space has opened up. We continue to give internships to youngsters who are also interested in this space. And as a result, I think what we have seen is perhaps, in our own way contributing, little to this to this mandate, because a lot of these youngsters then also go out, go abroad and study. So I think that also prepares them indirectly for some of these conversations that they will have with their counterparts better. So I do think that there is space for institutions like yours and ours and others to engage. But certainly, I think a university's capacity to do it is much higher than, say, a think tank.
Thank you for your time, Professor Pant, and sharing these thoughts, because there are some topics which a lot of young people want to know about. Right? How do we get educated? How do we articulate? So hopefully what we discussed here is useful to many of them.
Thank you, Shobit.